all the cities of the world, the capitals, the major power centers want to have some sort of object like this. Toronto has its CN Tower. French have the Eiffel Tower. Americans stole one of the obelisks, and they put it there in America. Now, again, when we go to our own sources, we see that, and sorry, the Arabic came out a little bit wrong when I made it transferred to the screen. But in Surah Al-Luqman, it is saying, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ أَنِ اشْكُرْ لِلَّهِ وَمَنْ يَشْكُرْ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ. We bestowed wisdom upon Luqman, and we enjoined upon him, saying, give thanks to Allah. Whoso gives thanks to Allah does so to his own good, and whoso disbelieves, let him know that Allah is sufficient, immensely praiseworthy. This is the area that Luqman came from, Nubia. And you can clearly see it's part of the Sudan. Again, this is an African person. There's a whole chapter of the Quran that is mentioned for this black African Muslim. Because remember, all of the prophets were Muslims. All of the guided people, all of those who submitted to one God from the beginning of time were Muslims. So this is Luqman, one of the wise people mentioned in the Quran. And he is from Nubia. And on the right, you can see where Nubia sits next to Ethiopia. And then you'll see Egypt there to the north. The Quran continues in Surah Luqman. And now, again, look at these black Muslims. It says Luqman is giving wisdom to his son. And he says, "O my son, establish prayer, enjoin what is right, forbid what is wrong, and be patient over what befalls you. Indeed, all that is of matters, indeed, that is of matters requiring determination, great determination." And then he said to his son, "And do not turn your cheek in contempt toward people, and do not walk through the earth exultantly in pride. Indeed, Allah does not like everyone self-deluded and boastful." And we know the man to the right is now in a big test about his pride and the pride of those who are his followers. Luqman is given the wisdom: be humble, but be confident, and do not walk in the earth as a boastful person. Allah is the one that has power of all things. And then he also talked about balance and self-control, and be moderate in your pace, and lower your voice. Indeed, the most disagreeable of sounds is the voice of donkeys. So this is great wisdom, which is expressed in the Quran to an African wise person named Luqman. May Allah be pleased with him. Now remember, just below Nubia was the area of Ethiopia, or in ancient terms, it was Aksum. And the Aksumite people were one of the most powerful nations in the world in the period of AD. And Mani, who was one of the great philosophers of Iraq and Persia, and a historian, he wrote on behalf of the ancient people, and he said around 300 AD or so, and this leads right into the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there were four great world powers. There was the Roman Empire, there was the Persian Empire, there were three kingdoms in China, and the fourth was Aksum. It was Ethiopia. This was one of the four great powers in the known world at the time. They had the largest obelisk in the world. Now, those who know history and they look at black people, they notice something different about them, right? There's a potential that is there. And this is why you see so much is being done to keep African people down today. But there's a resilience. That's what we're talking about. Black Muslim resilience, black resilience. Why did they keep going? What is it that they had? Thousands of years ago, remember, going back to Tarseti, the Nile, the ancient times, they were in a major position. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ was born in the year of the elephants. Amul Fil, because the great army of Abraha had attacked the Arabian Peninsula. And so therefore, East Africans, Axumites, were not known as weak people. Let's get this straight. They were powerful people, so powerful that the Arabs of Quraysh had to run into the hills, and it was only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sending birds carrying baked clay that ultimately destroyed the army of Abraha. So the Prophet ﷺ, when his people were being punished in the 5th year of the prophethood, he sent his people not to Syria, not to Iraq, not to Yemen, not to Pakistan, not to Malaysia. He sent them to Al-Habasha, Abyssinia, to Ethiopia. That was the Axumite land. And you can see in your map here, and you see Mecca and then Jeddah and the ports, the coastline is there. If you go right up across the Red Sea, which is not a long distance, especially if you go south, you will see Port Sudan in the present Sudan. And then you see Eritrea, Asmara is right there. And then you'll see Djibouti and going into Somalia, all this region there. So it is really around the area of Eritrea and the highlands in Ethiopia. This was the center of power of the Axumite dynasty. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if you go to Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for in it there is a king who will not tolerate oppression. It is a land of truth. Hiya ardu sidq. Go until such time as Allah shall relieve you from your distress. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, knew this. He knew about this land and these people. And he sent his people to a Najashi, which is his title, meaning the emperor. His name was Ashama. We know, in English, we say the Negus, okay, but in Arabic, it's An-Najashi. So he sent him there, and Ashama protected the Muslims. And there's a beautiful story around that first hijrah. He protected the Muslims and eventually accepted Islam himself. This is a picture of Masjid al-Najashi, which is in Aksum, which is in Negash, close to Aksum, in modern-day Ethiopia. And there are still traces there. 15 Sahabas died there and are buried. Najashi is also buried. It's a very peaceful place there in Negash. So this is the resilience of the people in that area. And the Prophet ﷺ even made janazah prayer for Najashi. This is the first time he made it for an absent person. And that showed that he definitely was a Muslim. Now, if we go further and you look at the dark green, you'll see the spread of Islam going right across North Africa. And it was mainly being carried by scholars and righteous people. The armies were there to fight the Romans, because the Romans were attacking from the north. And the Muslims made the intention to take all of the Byzantine holdings along the Mediterranean. Surprisingly enough, when they came to the land of Tunisia, they called it Ifrigo, and they Arabicized the word to Ifriqiya. And that's the first use of Africa, which eventually came into the modern language for the whole continent. The Muslims realized, along with the people of the north, that across the Sahara Desert were some amazing gold mines. Now again, remember what Toynbee and these people said. This place is a waste of time. There are only poor people living here. There's no modernization, no wealth, okay, no scholarship. Now let's look at reality. These lines you see are trade routes, like major highways across the Sea of Sand. Below, especially to the left, you'll see in West Africa, great empires of Takror and Mali and Gao were developing, the Songhai. These were the trade routes. And it was the largest gold depository in the world at the time. And the people became extremely rich and powerful. So great Muslim empires developed. There was Ghana, there was Takror, there was Mali, there was Songhai. There were other empires with hundreds and thousands of Muslims who were living there, with scholars, with masjids, everything. See, we're not privy to much of this information. But today, for Islamic history, we want to show the resilience of African people. Look at them crossing the Sahara Desert. I took this picture myself when I visited Timbuktu in Mali. Up until today, the Tuareg people, they prefer to go in the desert. So the family goes out in the desert and they camp, and then they come back in the city to do business during the day. So it was these trading groups that actually, the Malian kings, Mali was probably the greatest empire there in West Africa. And again, who are the famous people, the resilience of the people? Mansa Musa, or Mansa Kankan Musa. The word Mansa means Amir, or it means your king or your emperor. Mansa Musa made pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He carried 72,000 followers with him. And if you Google now, go online and Google, who is the richest man who ever lived? And pound for pound, the non-Muslims, the historians have agreed, this man here was the richest man who ever lived. When he made his pilgrimage, he had 15,000 camels laden with gold. When he returned from his pilgrimage, he brought books back with him, scholars, artifacts, missionaries, du'at. He built masjids, madrasas, all the way across Africa. And when he reached back to the Niger River, he fell in love with the city of Timbuktu. And you can see on your map there where the red is for Timbuktu. It's not out in space like many people will say, oh, go to Timbuktu, go get lost. No, it was a center of learning. And by the 16th century, Timbuktu had 150 schools and 25,000 students in its Sankore University. They were studying not only Quran, Hadith, Arabic, but they were studying astronomy, sciences, medicine. This is amazing because this is before the great universities in Europe. These are Black Africans now who are reaching the pinnacles of knowledge, along with the scholars in Morocco and in Egypt and in Baghdad and in other parts of the world. They were reaching very high levels. And this is important, and a lot of Muslims are not aware of this. They think Timbuktu is a joke. And this is part of our opening that we want to have in Islamic History Month, to open up these sources of knowledge. So Timbuktu produced rare books. It was even recognized by the Ottomans. The Ottoman sultans recognized the scholarship. They loved to get the Quran that was written by the great scholars there in Timbuktu in West Africa. Now, when Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage, he was interviewed by Al-Umari. And Al-Umari, who was a great writer who wrote Masalik al-Abrar fi Mamalik al-Amsar, he interviewed Mansa Musa, and he asked him about this power and authority, and Mansa said, I come from a lineage, and my older brother, Abu Bakr, crossed into the Atlantic with 2,000 ships. Now, remember, Mansa Musa is the richest man who ever lived. He got his wealth from his predecessor, who also had this unbelievable source of gold and wealth. This man, Mansa Abu Bakr, he invested his wealth in ships. Okay, so they traveled across. And one might say, how could you travel across the Atlantic in ancient times? But here is a picture of the currents. And if you see the currents here, you'll see how it can take you right from West Africa, right into Brazil, or right up into the Caribbean region and the West Indies. And to prove it, a Norwegian scientist, Thor Heyerdahl, actually had a boat made by African workers, and he left from Safi in Morocco, and he took the currents and he landed in Barbados in the West Indies. So these African Muslims, Mandinka, or the Mande people, they visited Brazil, Peru long before Columbus. And we find pictographs and the writings of the Mandinka all the way across into Central America. When the Spanish conquerors, conquistadors, came into the region, one of the famous ones, they say he discovered the Pacific. But how can you discover the Pacific like Columbus discovering America? Balboa, he found in the province of Cuareca, which is in Panama, they found people who were black people. And this is literally a bust, a sculpture that was made of these Malian Muslims, these African Muslims from Guinea, who are actually living there in Central America. If you look at the picture, you'll see the scarification, you'll see the turban and the cap. So this is clearly a Muslim. This was done long before Columbus. Okay. In Honduras, some of the African people call themselves Almamis. Remember this word, Almamis. Almami is actually from Imam, and then Imamu and Almami. That's how they say it in the Mandingo language, or in West Africa, the Fulanis. Many of them, they use the word Almamis. There's actually a tribe calling themselves like Almamis in Honduras. There's also Jaras and Guabas and Kaba and people from all over this region. And it appears from the sources that these Mandinka people actually made it into the United States. And it's a very interesting study. But what we have left is Garifuna people. The British call them Black Caribs, but they were there before the Europeans. They're all along the coastline of Central America to South America. These are African people, and many of them, especially in Belize, have a distinct African dialect that we are connecting with the Mandinka West African languages. After this, there was a great trauma. Now again, the resilience of the people. African people had developed great civilizations. Thousands of years ago, they built the pyramids. They had Aksum. They had great empires in West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa. But the Europeans now, coming out of their dark ages, needed a way to conquer the world. Muslims lost authority in Al-Andalus, in Spain. So the Portuguese and the Spanish, taking our technology, then crossed, and they found the territories of the Americas that had been settled for thousands of years, as we know. And they tricked some of the Africans to sell their brothers and sisters who had been captured in war, and they enslaved these Africans, and they brought them to the Americas. So you can see the purple gives you the ports of call, where slaves were actually being taken into the Americas. Now, I just want to, give an aside here, because, we're trying to clear up deceptions. Because number one, slavery was a worldwide institution. So even in the time of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, it wasn't black people only who were slaves. Salman al-Farisi, the Persian, came into Medina as a slave. Suhaib al-Rumi, right, the Roman who was Iraqi origin, came into Medina. He's white, blonde hair, blue eyes, as a slave. Zayd ibn Haritha was Arab, a slave. And so it was not based on color, but it was based upon your being weak and being captured, and somebody could control you, especially if you were a prisoner of war after a great battle. And the word slave in English actually comes from Slav. The Slavic and Germanic people. They were the slaves of the Romans. So this is why we're using the word slave. It actually comes from Slav. The main sources of slavery were kidnapping, debts, the sale of children, punishment for crime, and then lineage if you were born in slavery. But the main one was war. And you can see here Mongols and Chinese enslaving each other. It was all over the world that slavery was being. When Islam came, it waged a systematic struggle against slavery. And it phased out the different ways of becoming a slave. The only thing that was left was a form of what I call controlled bonded servitude. And this was for prisoners of war. And the Prophet ﷺ was even phasing this out. The Quran was actually phasing out all forms of bondage. And that was the movement of Islam, against the subjugation of people. And it was only some of the weak-minded Muslim leaders afterwards, following other nations, who reverted back to taking slaves and using them in their court. But the basic position of the Muslims was to resist slavery. That's part of the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So when we go to West Africa, where the slavery had reached its peak in the 16th, 17th century, now the Europeans, there was a famous imam, and again they used the word al-Mami. Remember that word from Central America? There was a great al-Mami, Abdul Qadir Khan, of the Futa Toro, and he was a teacher of the Quran and Maliki fiqh, and he lived near Bundu in the Futa Toro region, and he led a major rebellion against the colonial rule there in West Africa. It was the French who were in this area, and in 1776 he actually formed an anti-slavery movement. That's long before the abolitionists in America and Europe, right? So there was an anti-slavery movement by Muslims, in West Africa. Okay, so they resisted slavery. They did not lay down and allow themselves to be captured. And he said in words, he wrote to the French governor in 1789, "We are warning you that all of those who will come to our land to trade in slaves will be killed or massacred if you do not send our children back. Would not somebody who was very hungry abstain from eating if he had to eat something cooked with his blood?" See, he's given like a warning. "We absolutely do not want you to buy Muslims under any circumstances." And the reason why he said that, because he was basically ruling Muslims. "You should stay home and not come to our country anymore, because all of those who will come can be assured they will lose their life." Now, the British governor of Senegal in 1811, he said, "It may be necessary to remark that there has been great facility in negotiating with Al-Mami Abdul Qadir, and less probability of, again, having a dispute with him in consequence of the abolition of the slave trade, a commerce which Prince Abdul Qadir always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion, and means through which several of his subjects, followers of the Prophet, were led into captivity." This is found in the book, The Walking Quran, in page 143. So you can see there's an abolitionist movement, anti-slave movement that was there. The French governor later wrote, "Nothing could take away from these Fula people," meaning the Fulani people, the Muslims, "the idea that in forbidding the trade in slaves, the Europeans were emboldened by their example. They are proud to have bypassed us in the progress of reason, justice, and humanity." Okay, so this is a different concept of Black people and Black Muslim people when you actually read the history. Despite this, countless numbers of people were carried across the Middle Passage. And this is like a triangle. So the boats would come from Europe, land on the coast of Africa, and then go to the Americas, Brazil, Caribbean, US, and eventually they even came up to Canada, and then go back. So it's like a triangle. Okay, but the African people resisted. There were slave revolts. Some people committed suicide on the ships. And surprisingly enough, we have documented proof that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the enslaved Africans and political prisoners taken to the Western Hemisphere were Muslims. This is amazing. And people did not realize this 30 years ago. What is the proof? This is what people will say. There's a number of eyewitness reports, written documents, autobiographies, and different points of information that have come to the surface. This, on the left, you can see some of the documents themselves, written by slaves. Okay, look at the resilience. Look at some of the heroes. Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim was born in Timbo in 1762, educated in Timbuktu, right? enslaved in Mississippi. He returned home in 1829. He actually won his freedom. Ayub ibn Suleiman was born in 1700 in Bundu in eastern Senegal, enslaved and taken to Maryland. He was a scholar. He prayed 5 times a day. He wrote the whole Quran from his memory. He eventually won his freedom and returned to Africa. Omar ibn Sayyid, who wrote his own story in Arabic. You can see his writing on the left. That's a picture of him. It still exists today. You can go to libraries in America, museums, and you'll see the writing of Omar bin Sayyid. Oh, Lizzie Gray, a Muslim woman who died in South Carolina. She was reported to have said they thought they converted her to Christianity. But then they asked her, tell us about Christ. And she said Christ built the first church in Mecca, and his grave was there. She was meant Medina, actually. But you see what she's saying about Christ? She's still thinking about the Prophet ﷺ. She's a Muslim hiding her identity. Resilience. Fatima or Phoebe, the wife of Bilali Muhammad. These are famous Muslims from the Sapelo Islands off the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas. Francois Macandal. He was born in Guinea, and Bookman. They were both Marabout, which are Morabits. They were traveling scholars, and they were in Haiti, and they started the revolution on the plantations. And it was the great Toussaint Louverture, who then came along later and organized the revolutions. Mohammed Kaaba from Buka, from Malinke, Guinea. He was studying to be a judge. He was captured at 20 and deported to Jamaica. Abu Bakr Siddiq, a cleric from Timbuktu, was captured and taken to Jamaica in 1834. He wrote extensively in Arabic. Look at some of the writings. The Maroons, who are well known, Maroon Rebellions, all over the region. Probably the most famous Maroon Rebellions were in Jamaica. The Spanish called the slaves who escaped cimarrones, which means like a wild horse, uncontrollable. So they say Maroons. And there were great rebellions. We know now from traveling in the area, and Jamaican Muslims have found the Juma hole, which is there in the cockpit section, in Jamaica, Akapong. And there is Nanny of the Maroons, there is Sam Shop, and there's definite proof that many of the Maroons were Muslim. Not all of them. Many of them were Muslims. The second Maroon Rebellion in 1795, this is in Trelawney in Jamaica. It was a standoff, and a truce was done, and some of the Maroons were tricked, and they were sent to Nova Scotia, to Canada. And from there, they were sent to Sierra Leone. So the connection is there. And rebellions broke out. Brazil, Suriname, Trinidad, all over the region, United States, even Mexico. There were actually African rebellions. Many of them Muslims were involved. And African Muslims suffered greatly. They suffered greatly all in this time, but resilience. Even though they were forced not to speak their language, they could not read Arabic or write it. It was against the law. You couldn't fast. You couldn't pray. You had to eat pork. Your families are scattered. But still resilience. Resilience among the African people and resilience amongst the African Muslims. This is an amazing story because when you look at them, they leave a legacy of Tawheed, of monotheism, of inclusion, a legacy of Tahara, meaning purity in body, mind, and spirit, a legacy of calling to righteousness and forbidding evil and corruption. And it was the people, it was the Muslims from the South, meaning the Carolinas and Georgia, that's where they were concentrated, when African people were forced to go north, when the Ku Klux Klan was terrorizing people. And finally, African people went to the big cities of the North in the United States. They started to run into Muslims that were there, and they started to return to their faith. And there are a number of different groups, some pseudo-Muslim groups that took on Muslim names that weren't completely practicing Islam. But alhamdulillah, the Sunnah, the Muslims of the Sunnah were also there. And this is a picture of Masjid Taqwa in Brooklyn, New York. There was a great movement called the Dar al-Islam movement, which was founded by Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal. He's probably the most famous of the African Sunni Muslims. He used to be based in State Street Mosque in Brooklyn. And this is resilience, right? This continues on and it spreads until now. People like Imam Siraj Wahaj and other leaders in America, they're still spreading Islam. There are organizations like MENA, Muslim American and Muslim Alliance of North America, which are forming. And Islam is still the fastest growing religion in the Americas. Not only African Americans, but Hispanics are accepting. There are also Native people and some white Americans as well are accepting. But amongst the African Muslim, this is the largest concentration. This is resilience. After all of this pain and suffering, after 500 years of coming into this region, there are African people who are coming back into Islam in Brazil, in the Guyanas, especially Dutch Guyana, Suriname, in Trinidad, in Barbados, in Panama, in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, in Bermuda, all over the region. People are coming in the United States, and now in Canada also, alhamdulillah. And so the legacy continues. And, you know, one of our famous people, we always show him at the end because he's such a beautiful example, you know, of beneficial Islam in the 20th century. This is Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, known as Malcolm X. Near the end of his life, you see him in the clothes of the scholars. So this is cultural continuity. This is resilience. The teachings of the Quran is alive, and he's got it in his hands. So this is Black Muslim resilience. And this is something that needs to be known in our community. Most of our brothers and sisters who came from overseas do not understand this history. And so we have given you a glimpse of this in our opening section of Islamic History Month of the Islamic Institute of Toronto. And so with this, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this month and to bless us with knowledge in Islamic History Month. And I ask Allah to unite our ranks and to bring our hearts together and to forgive us for any of the mistakes that we have made, for we know not what we do. I leave you with these thoughts. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.